Hi there, salve. Welcome to Interview Insights, organized by the US-Italy Forum. I'm Claudia Flisi, a journalist in Washington, D.C., and a graduate of SCIUS, the School of Advanced International Studies, which hosts the forum. Today's conversation is with Dr. Alessio Terzi, an economist at the European Commission in Brussels. He's going to tell us about his new book, Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe, which was published in 2022. Previously, Dr. Terzi worked at the Brussels think tank Bruegel, and he was a Fulbright Scholar at Harvard's Kennedy School. His practical experience includes the European Central Bank and BMI Research, a UK-based market analysis firm. Dr. Terzi earned his PhD in economics from the Hertie School of Berlin, a master's in economics from the London School of Economics, and a bachelor's degree also in economics from Bocconi University of Milan. So he has widespread European experience, all in economics. So Dr. Terzi, benvenuto. Could you please describe in a few sentences for those of us listening who have not read the book, what you'd like to highlight about this book, about the theme, and your main takeaways for readers? I know it's hard when you've spent a lot of time on the book to synthesize it, but just in a few sentences.
Thank you, Claudia, for the introduction. A lot of economics in there, but actually the book is it is a book that touches on the economy, but is not an economics textbook. And the reason for that is that it tries to answer questions that I feel many people have on their minds, which is a bit the relationship between the economy and nature, loosely speaking, and trying to understand how or whether we can work on both fronts. And so to have an expanding economy while at the same time tackling the environmental challenges, the climate challenges we have, and whether we can do that within a capitalistic system. In a nutshell, or in one sentence, given you asked me to do so in two sentences, it is whether profit and planet can be reconciled, and we can add people. So whether people, planet, and profit are three things that can go hand in hand, or whether they are irremediably at odds.
People, planet, and profit. Okay. This is a theme, not perhaps as eloquently expressed, but this is a theme that's been discussed by scientists for decades. But there seems to be new urgency to the issue of greening. Your book addresses it, but many headlines also address it. In your view, have the pace of change and the attendant risk accelerated in recent years? And if so, in what ways? The headlines would suggest that the risks have, but perhaps you have a different view.
No, of course. I mean, climate change is materializing. Is already happening, and we are starting to see its effects in the form of droughts and floods and extreme temperatures around the globe. And so I think that has given renewed urgency to a problem that was discussed, I feel, for many decades now among scientists, but perhaps less so in the wider public. And now it is a pressing matter, in part also thanks to efforts of people like Greta Thunberg, the Fridays for Future, the fact that indeed the environmental dimension is more present in people's minds. And therefore, indeed, that's more central and gives more resonance to this type of thinking and message.
You think that's equally true in the Western Hemisphere and the East, or is there more emphasis in some areas than others?
I mean, of course, I am more of an expert of the European setting and a bit of the US one. But indeed, even just basing it on data, my perception and my reading of it is that across the world, people are concerned about climate change, in part because the impacts that I was mentioning before, whether it is floods or droughts or extreme weather events, are happening all around the world, whether it is in the Sahel, whether it is in China, whether it is in Pakistan, whether it is in India. So it is not something that only the richer part of the world is realizing. So a concern is there. Then how to tackle it, or the speed at which progress can happen, is of course heterogeneous. but the concern is definitely there.
Right. You use a number of terms in your book, not only economic terms, but also terms that are more familiar to people who have followed climate change more attentively. One of them is degrowth, and you refer to degrowth as a challenge for GDP for measuring prosperity. For those who are listening or who are reading the book, unfamiliar with these terms, could you explain what you mean by degrowth and what its implications are?
It is, I mean, I would say in the book starts as a reflection on the relationship between the economy and nature. And indeed, while I was doing my research for this book, I realized that there was a school of thought, perhaps at the margin of mainstream economics, so squarely heterodox economics and drawing from other disciplines as well, sociology, anthropology, that effectively says, no, actually, the economy is the problem, or the growing size of the economy is the problem in itself. There is no way to fight climate change, to improve our environmental indicators, quality of water, quality of air, biodiversity, and so on, without shrinking the economy. And so that is should be the goal. And so what I try to do in the book is to say, look, I feel that a lot of the issues, questions that degrowth attempts to answer are in people's minds, and they are often dismissed in a bit of a curt way by mainstream economists, just saying, you know, this doesn't make any sense, and so we're not going to talk about it. And instead, I tried to do that. And the first part of the book, you have probably seen it, Claudia, is indeed an attempt to discuss the school of thought in an objective way as much as possible before trying to understand where I think that perhaps the problems with this worldview are.
But degrowth for the economy, isn't there also an aspect of degrowth with population? Because isn't the population growth itself, which is connected to the economy, of course, but maybe a little less directly, isn't population also an issue in terms of the environment?
So indeed, this whole debate, you were hinting at it, Claudia, goes back at least to the 70s, 60s and 70s, the rise of the environmental movement, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, famous book for environmentalists. And at the time, the concern was very much squarely on population and population growth. And so there was a lot of debate on whether there was a population bomb, as Paul Ehrlich was calling it, with another famous book. Nowadays, also degrowth scholars are less focused on population growth, in part because populations in the richer part of the world are not growing that much. Population is stabilizing at best in the richer OECD countries, richer countries, and in many countries it is dropping, whether it is Japan, whether it is Italy, and others, Germany. And so it is not so much the population dimension for rich countries, and the shrinking component is typically addressed to richer nations, because the idea is poorer countries still need to grow the economy, and in any case, their populations are growing indeed, but they have a very limited impact, let's say emissions per capita, or the impact on nature in many of the poorest nations of the world is very small. And so it is not so much a matter of shrinking population right now, at least to their reading.
And another term you use is whole of nation, a whole of nation approach. And you recommend a whole of nation approach to avoid climate disaster. So if you could define that, and in noting that it calls for a unified political will, which seems to be less and less obtainable in today's polarized climate, and not only in the US, also in Europe, and perhaps, no, not perhaps, also in other countries as well, in other parts of the world. So how will this come about?
No, indeed. So I guess departing from this degrowth perspective of worldview, what I try to argue in the book is, look, economic growth didn't start with the Industrial Revolution. It didn't start recently. It's a longer term phenomenon. And in a way, it means that it doesn't depend on burning fossil fuels, on producing greenhouse gases. And so a different type of growth is needed. So we need a different growth model than the one we have right now, given we live in a fossil fuel civilization. And the question there is, how do we reach it? And very often, I feel the focus is on government policies, and whether it is pricing CO2 emissions or regulation, and the many things that governments can do, public investment plans, and so on. And surely there's a lot of that, and in the book I speak about that, and I recognize the important role of governments. But it doesn't stop at that. And that is a crucial point to me, because the green transition, to my mind, is not a government agenda and one that can be done by governments alone. And that's why you need, to my mind, both businesses contributing to this, and crucially, citizens contributing to this, given they are also consumers, and employees, and so they can push from within, for change from within the capitalistic system or their private corporations. And when I speak of a whole of nation approach, I say what I mean is all of these forces sort of need to come together, or all of these pieces of the jigsaw need to come together to have that action. Now, I am not calling for a Pollyannish moment in which everybody will come together, see the importance of climate change, and change all their behaviors. I'm not calling for that. But I'm just saying we need some pioneers in all of these spheres. We need some pioneering businesses. We need some pioneering avant-garde governments that are taking those important steps on the green transition. And we need some pioneering green consumers that are willing to pay perhaps an early price in terms of green options being more expensive or initially less convenient. But as a matter of fact, as these things start playing out, they will become, let's say, a green wave is possible, bringing on board also those that are not pioneers in this respect.
Relating to that, another term you use in the book is stranded assets. And you say that the cost of greening will create stranded assets. So if you can define for our audience what that means, and then go on to respond. Doesn't stranded assets, given that most of them are held in the US and the UK, the richest, two of the richest countries, well, the richest and one of the richer countries, doesn't this complicate the building of consensus? Because as you well note in your book, green policy and inclusive social policy must proceed hand in hand, or people will oppose the transition, what you've just alluded to. So you could focus a little bit on stranded assets and what that means.
So stranded assets relate to this idea in a nutshell, without using technical terms, relates to the idea that we've got a lot of investment basically done in the fossil fuel economy right now, whether it is oil rigs, whether it is the infrastructure to carry petrol around, whether it is anything that is related, coal extraction points and so on. So all of that, if we believe, as I believe, that we need to transition to a net zero economy or a climate neutral economy, all of that we will not be able to use anymore. And so some of my fellow economists tell me, look, this transition is very expensive because we've done all these investments and we were planning to use them for a century or a bit less. And instead now we sort of have to abandon them there to focus on the green economy. And so these are costs, and therefore the green transition carries costs. Now, to my mind, of course, this is true on the surface of it, but I believe that these costs that are real will be shadowed by some benefits that are much larger. And if you think about it, my reading of what we have ahead of us is something that resembles an industrial revolution or a new industrial revolution, in the sense that we have to restructure our whole economy and transform our whole economy a bit in the same way in which we did during an industrial revolution. And if you think back, Claudia, to industrial revolutions, the first thing that comes to your mind is not stranded assets. Of course, we were switching from
horses.
From trees and tree burning to a coal economy and steam engines. The first thing you think about is not stranded assets. When we were switching from using horses to cars, the first thing you think about is not stranded assets. So even though it created stranded assets at the time. I'm sure that a lot of saddle makers
Right.
went out of business. I am sure that there was a lot of infrastructure in terms of points where you would change horses and so on. But of course, you're opening up new opportunities, and the new opportunities will be much larger than the costs. But of course, there will be winners and losers, and that's something that we've learned from past industrial revolutions. And that is something that I am very well aware of. And there is a call in the book to make sure that this green transition that we have to do against a timeline that is given by climate scientists. So we're using policies to make sure that this transition or this new industrial revolution happens at a very fast pace in order to reach net zero emissions by 2050. While you're doing that, you have to make sure that people are on board and that you don't abandon them or leave them behind.
Right. Well, in following up with that, speaking as a clear-eyed academic, you seem to have your ducks all in a row with that. You note in your book, quote, the green transition will require a complete transformation of basically all of production, consumption, agriculture, housing, transport, and in essence, the whole structure of the economy, what you've just said. That makes politicians, and not only politicians, really nervous. How can you soften this message to sell it in increments to politicians and not only to them? Or are we beyond the point of increments, given the timeline that you have alluded to in terms of 2050?
First, I don't think it should change shouldn't scare, or I know that very often it does. From the surface of it, change is not necessarily a bad thing, and that's what I'm trying to say. A lot of the message of the book, especially towards the end of it, is to say, look, actually, this is not the technological end of history to a certain extent. This is a wave of innovation, and that there are great opportunities. The green option, the electrified option, whether it is in cars, in new ways of producing steel, new ways of producing energy, and so on, might very well be more efficient, more cheaper. It comes with health benefits in terms of less pollution in our cities. It comes with benefits in terms of health. A lot of deaths these days are, of course, due to pollution in cities, to exhaustion of cars, and all of that we could get rid of as part of the green transition. So there are a lot of benefits there. So it is a challenge, but you can be a winner, and if you are a winner, there's a lot of reward in that. And so to a certain extent, I am not calling for a revolution. So I am not saying, oh, we're throwing out the whole economy from one day to the next. It is just that the challenge is huge. And so you have to plan in time. And we're trying to do something that is unprecedented at the speed at which it has happened. So a full transformation of the economy has happened in the past. The first industrial revolution took at least 70 to 80 years to pan out. Similarly, for the second industrial revolution, here we have roughly 30 years. And so all I'm saying is we have to get the incentives straight so that you create a wave of innovation that allows for this transformation to happen while keeping people on board. Because, Claudia, of course, we could cancel these emissions from one day to another. We could just close our energy plants tomorrow, but that would just lead to social unrest. Well, we've seen it to a certain extent during the energy crisis. People are not happy if their energy bill goes through the roof from one day to the next. We could lock people at home, as we have during the lockdowns for COVID, but that doesn't lead people to be happy. And bear in mind that under COVID, the pact with citizens was that this was very much a temporary measure, whereas here we would talk about effectively we would use this for the next 30 years at least. Right. And so obviously it's a no-go. And so the key is how to square the needs that come from climate science with the needs that come from social sciences, and therefore keeping people on board and keeping their living standards reasonable, if not improving, in the transition to a new economy.
You seem to be an optimist. I know you're Italian born, although your experience is international. And in chapter 4, you focus on Italy as a case study for your thesis. Italy is, as we know, because I'm also Italian, is unique in many ways, as is every country. What can the US and other countries, not only in the West, what can they take away from the Italian example? And the Italian experience in terms of your thesis?
Yeah, the book and even to a certain extent our chat up until now sounds rather abstract and referencing past industrial revolutions and so on. But actually the book is quite practical as well. And this practical angle, which in part reflects also my double, if not triple personality, working in policy, but also academia, dealing with think tanks and so on. This practicality is reflected in some more in a chapter, the one that you're mentioning, that is a bit of a case study. And the case studies on Italy, which indeed is a country I've studied extensively also within within my many economics chapters of my life. And what I'm trying to say there is, look, Italy is a country that by accident, so not by design, sort of fell into this steady state type of economy. It is a country that, after all, has experienced effectively zero GDP, per capita GDP growth over the past 30 years. And what I'm saying there is, look, there are some negative dynamics that are unleashed when you enter in a steady state type of environment. Things like you have less resources, because you have less resources, you have less to invest, and in part less to invest in research, in know-how, and in part there are also negative dynamic forces that are unleashed, especially if other countries continue growing. One of the other countries around you. And so one of the examples is, look, if wages continue to improve and productivity continues to improve abroad, effectively this will suck out resources from Italy itself. And so people, talent, scientists will move abroad, some to the US, some to other parts of Europe and elsewhere, attracted by greater rewards, not only in terms of wages, but also in terms of labs and resources to continue conducting their research. And so all I'm saying is, look, dynamically, this idea that one country will enter into steady state and everything is fine and good is sort of disproved even just by the example of Italy.
Right. Oh, and you yourself are an example. You're Italian born and you're not working in Italy right now, or at least not prevalently. Let's jump to the last question, skipping a few others because we're running out of time. The implications you summarize in your research might resonate in certain political climates, maybe in Scandinavia, maybe to some extent in Germany, but definitely not in others. So you seem to be optimistic. How can you encourage the rest of us to be less despondent? And what can the average citizen do? Because you allude to the importance of the average citizen, as well as the business leader, and as well as the government person, and as well as the bureaucrat. What should people do after reading your book? Of course, they should buy it and read it, but what should they do after reading your book?
So regarding the messaging and why some people are less my connecting to the conversation we've had up until now is, I think that there is a lot of either fear or by some, or belief that they can sort of avoid this, and that, you know, they duck a political trend of the moment and this problem is sort of going to go away, or think that others are going to do the decarbonization and you can continue doing your own thing. Whereas the book sort of tries to combat this reading, saying, look, the green economy is happening, and it is happening because, and the green transition is happening because the alternative is worse, and effectively would mean that we enter into a hellscape of climate on this earth. And so as it starts playing out, the green option will increasingly be seen as modernity. It will be seen as the new option. It will rapidly become the cheaper option available because it gets rolled out, investments come in, firms become better at producing electric cars, heat pumps, renewables, solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, and so on. And as all of that happens, you can choose to be a laggard. You can choose to try and block yourself into current technologies, but you will be stuck in the past with something that is soon less efficient, more pricey, less desirable. And so it is not a positive scenario, and rather you want to try and see how you can jump on this green train and be part of the future green economy. And again, there are great benefits, great rewards to be reaped. In terms of what people can do, my message is optimistic. And again, I reiterate, to a certain extent, my message is one that places, that says, capitalism can be made green. There is a strong role for innovation. Because there is a strong role for innovation, there's a strong role for governments for sure, but for companies, a lot of the innovation happens in the private sector. In terms of research, but particularly in terms of deploying the new technologies, improving them, making these electric vehicles cheaper and more widely available. So it sounds a bit like, the green transition is somebody else's business, and we as consumers can sit back, relax, and wait for the magic forces of capitalism to take care. But it's not that. In part, I was alluding to this in the fact that we need consumers on board and citizens because they need to vote eventually for these policies or for the governments that adopt these policies, and consumers because, as I was saying initially, there might be a green premium to pay. It is a fact that right now an electric vehicle is a bit more expensive than an internal combustion engine car. This is not going to be true for long, but early on you need those that can and those that care the most to spend that extra amount on the initial pioneering green technology so that it can get rolled out, become cheaper, and then widely available to all. And finally, there's a lot we can do in terms of our habits. Again, you can do the green transition with investments, with private firms doing the innovation and so on, but it costs quite a bit and it takes a bit of time. Very often, so for things that really matter for your quality of life, we're going to do it because we don't want quality of life to be shattered by this green transition, because we would lose people's approvals. But very often we do things just out of habit, and these habits could be changed without significant changes to our well-being. And the examples, go on a variety of things in reducing meat consumption. Again, I'm not calling for everybody to become a vegan, maybe to not eat that extra steak when it's not felt as needed. Perhaps use a train rather than a plane for short distances. I'm speaking less than an hour and a half by train. To turn down the thermostat. Bear in mind that these three things, so effectively diet, heating at home, and transport together represent 80% of our direct emissions as consumers. So with these three things, operating on these three fronts is what matters. Then I've had people in some of these events tell me, but I'm reducing the emails I send because they are also using electricity and so on. Good, do it if you can, but these are peanuts with respect to these three big ticket items. So focus on these. The more you can reduce, and it's not a matter of being perfect. Any improvement helps, and it can happen now. If you take a bike instead of taking a car, again, for short distances in town, those are emissions that you're sparing us from immediately. If I have to decarbonize the whole electricity grid, you have to buy an electric vehicle and so on. This takes investment, it takes money for you, it takes time. So I'm all in favor of changing behaviors. The more we have people on board, the better.
Okay, sounds like everybody should read the book and then follow your advice, and then we will be more positive and optimistic and less despondent about the future. So it's a good note on which to end. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and good luck with your messaging. Thank you. Buongiorno.
Thank you very much.